Mic working? Yeah, there we go. Buenos dias. Very happy to be in Santiago. This is, I consider this to be the first talk about visualization, the most basic talk that helps people understand the design process so that they can then think through the process of designing a visualization so that it's effective, it communicates usefully. And the talk is designed to work with any tool, any software, on a whiteboard, pencil and paper, anything. It's about the process, it's not about the tools. So you can take this and you can apply it to any tool that you're using. It's also a pretty good process for designing communication in general. So we'll talk about it like it's for visualization, but you can use this to design a document to pitch to investors or anything like that. The first question is, why visualization? Why do we care about visualization instead of anything else? This is a sample data set, an educational data set. And you can see there's 4 little sections, 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you look at the Y values in each section, if you apply statistical methods, the Y values all look about the same on these 4 data sets. Same average, same standard deviation. There's a few other statistical tests. It looks pretty much the same. And as a human, if we look at a spreadsheet or a table of numbers, it's difficult to learn anything. If there's a particular value that I want to look for in one of these data sets, I can scan and say, oh, I'm going to look at set number 4 in the 3rd row. I can go find the number that I'm looking for, but it's hard for me to see anything else interesting about these data sets. But if I graph these, if I visualize them, they're really different and they're really interesting. So this is a view of the data that the statistical methods would not show us necessarily unless we knew what to look for. I want to point some things out. We notice immediately when we look at these, we notice the data points that are the outliers that don't fit, and they don't fit the trend, they don't fit the pattern. We're very good at noticing when there's a pattern, when there's a gap here in the pattern or the gap down there, and then the outlier that's far away from the pattern. Our brain is really, really good at this. Our brain is a pattern detecting machine. We have really excellent hardware in our eyeballs and our optic nerves, and really excellent software in our brain that's all built to do visualization work, to do pattern recognition. The largest data signal into your brain is through your eyes. I saw one study that estimated the speed of data coming in through your eyes about 8 or 9 megabits per second, so about the speed of first generation Wi-Fi. And we have really good software in our brain that does things like edge detection. You look at the screen, we're very good at finding the edges of the screen. We have compression algorithms that run in our brain. If you look at a brick wall, you don't see every single brick. Your brain says, right, brick wall. I know what a brick wall looks like, every brick. But you don't have to count and look and see every brick to see that there's a brick wall there. So there's very, very sophisticated things happening in your eyeball and in your brain that help us detect and gain information from visualization. And like I said, we're very good at patterns, so we see when there's a trend and then we see when there's a gap. If you have a brick wall and one brick is missing, it's very easy to see, that one's one missing right there. The foundational research underneath most of modern visualization was done in the early 80s by Cleveland and McGill. And what they studied was, given all these different ways of encoding data by placement, by length, by angle, given all these different ways, which ones are the most precise? Which are the ones that are easiest to take different kinds of information away from? We're going to talk a lot more about this later on in the talk, and there's a free download of a whole table of all this that we'll talk about, so we'll get there. The short version that we want to learn from this slide, though, is position is the most precise, the most powerful. We have the best precision. So you can see this one's a little bit lower than these two. Not much, only a few pixels. But everybody in the room can agree that this little dot is a little bit lower than the other ones. We have really good precision there. As we go down the list, so the next one, comparing length versus comparing length here, comparing angles all the way down, we get less precise, we get less accurate. It's harder for us to take numerical precision interpretations away from these other methods of turning data into visual shapes. We'll talk a lot more about that. But this is the basis that informs the rest of the talk. Okay, so this is the process. These are the 4 pillars. Number 1, you have to define your purpose and understand why you're doing this, who's it for, all that sort of thing. Number 2, you have to pick your content. We have a lot of data available to us. We have to focus on the data that's most important. We're going to talk a ton more about all these, by the way. Number 3, you have to pick a structure, the graph type. How does it fit on the page? Number 4, formatting helps us focus and makes things more interesting. So let's talk about all 4 of these. Number 1, purpose. You have to know your customer. This is my boss. This is Jeff Bezos. Runs Amazon. So I have to make him happy because that's my job. But you have other customers. You have other bosses. It's very tempting to start with technology. We all love technology. That's why we're here. But if we start technology, we run the risk of forgetting our customer. One thing that I try to remind people is if you start with a customer need, you can then pick the right technology to make your customer happy. But if you start with the technology, you get locked into the technology, and sometimes it can be harder to make the customer happy if you've already made the choice of your technology. Have to start with the customer. And then all kinds of questions about that. Why am I creating this? Who's it for? Who's my customer? What does my customer need to understand? What questions are they trying to answer? What actions do I need to inform, or what actions do I need to let them take? What's the most important takeaway message from this visualization? Also very important, think about how it will be consumed. So an interactive on a big display is very different from an interactive on a small display, and those are both very different. Maybe you have to print out a black and white PDF onto paper and hand it out in a meeting on paper, so you get no color and no interactivity. These are all important considerations when you're designing how your visualization is going to look, whether there's interactivity, that sort of thing. So you have to spend some time really understanding your purpose, really understanding why you're there. I live up here in Seattle. I could probably drive to New York without a map. You pretty much go east until you get to the ocean, and then you decide if you need to turn left or right to go to New York. But if somebody gives me a map to New York, that's better. This is almost the same. This is a map to Baltimore. It's pretty close to New York, not very different. But if I really want to go to New York, and you give me a map to Baltimore, it's not terrible, but it's not perfect. If you have customers who have a little bit of a different need, if they have a little bit of a different destination, it's really nice to give them exactly the map they need. Maybe you give them a slightly different version of the report. Maybe you build them a slightly different map to get exactly the information that they need to be successful. So the more specific you can get about your purpose, the more useful it will be for you as a designer. Showing the revenues. It's not very exciting. We all know that we have revenues. We know we have to talk about it. But if we can get really specific about what we have to show the growth and return changes per category over the last 3 years to potential investors. This is really good, because as a designer, this makes my life easy. It tells me who my customer is. It tells me what data I need to include. It gives me some constraints on what time period I need to use. This is really helpful, and it helps me make a more precise document. It helps me make a better map to give to the customers if I can really clearly say exactly who it's for and what we want to show them. I've given this talk a lot. I've given different versions of this talk a lot. At one point, I decided I can fit this into one tweet. Here's the one tweet version. People come and they say, "What graph should I use?" And I say, "You're starting at the wrong end. That's the last step. That's the very end of the process. You have to start here. What do I care about? What does my customer care about?" And then they tell you what the customer cares about, and you say, "Great, so what action are we informing?" right? The customer needs to make a choice. They need to make a decision. We know what they care about. So now we know what action they need to inform. Okay, so to inform an action, what questions do they have to answer? We know the question, what data matters to them? After all that, the graph is really easy. The graph falls in your lap if you already know the questions you're answering, if you already know the right data, all these other things. You have to start with you, with your customer. What do they care about? All those things. That makes the whole process much, much easier. Also, data is good. We all like data. There's a lot of data. If you spend some time and you refine the data, you clean it up a little bit, you make it nice and orderly, you put it in a nice human consumable database spreadsheet, that's better. We've added some value. Now we have information. If we look through the information, we find the interesting pieces, we decide what's most relevant. Now we can get some answers from the data. We've added more value. Once we have the answer, we can take an action. Now we've added a lot of value. We don't need the whole database. We just need to know what the action or the recommendation is. This process of going from data to actions, that's expensive. It takes time and it takes effort. Your customer will probably do it if they have to, but if you can do it for them, if you can do the hard work for your customer and give them the answer, recommend the action to them without them having to do all the math, without them having to do all the calculation, that adds a lot of value. And it makes you look good, and it helps make your customer more successful. Success is about providing answers to your customer. Your visualization, if you're going to give it to somebody, you can say, here's the database, good luck. Or you can say, here's some answers for you. You can see it makes their life better. So you can imagine the same table or the same graph. Revenue growth, yeah, okay, I understand. I can give them the same table or the same graph, but instead I can put an answer. This is even just in the title. I don't even have to change the graph. Just changing the title that says, here's the answer. This is what you need to learn from this table. This is what you need to learn from the graph. These are the 5 that are the most important. These are the most interesting thing. Forget the rest of the table. Just look at these 5. This is where the answer is. If you do that work for your customer, you make it easier for them to succeed. I know I keep saying the same thing, but this is the most important thing. Do the work for your customer. Give them the answers they need to be successful. It makes you look good. It makes you successful. Okay, that was purpose. Going on, number 2, let's talk about content. The question for content is what data matters? What is the relationship between the data that matters the most? We learn this from our purpose. Our purpose tells us what we care about. That helps us pick the content. The important thing here, what we exclude, what we leave out, is as important as what we include. We probably want to leave out a lot of data. I spent in school 16 years of people saying, show your work. So you'd write down all the homework, write down how you got the, hand in the stack of papers. That was good, right? Now, on the job, my boss doesn't want to see all the work. He says, just tell me the answer. I trust you. I pay you. If I didn't think you could do the work, you wouldn't have a job. Just tell me the answer. I don't want to see your work. That's your job. They just want the answers, usually. If we don't know what our purpose is, if we don't know what our customer needs, we just put everything in the dashboard. Put the whole database on the dashboard. I'm sure the answer's in there somewhere. Right? I can't be wrong if all the data's there. The problem with this is it gets harder and harder to find the answer I'm looking for. The more things that are on the screen, the harder it is to find the piece that I care about. If you can focus, if you can show less, it's easier and faster to find the piece that's most important. This is not a map. This is 1 dot per person in 2010 in the United States. 308 million dots. And they're color-coded. You see there's a lot of green here, there's some orange and some yellow here, different colors, They're color-coded by the race or the ethnicity of the person. So with 300 million dots,
Con 300
we can learn some things.
millones de puntos,
There's a lot of people in the east.
algunos datos, ¿no?
There's not very many people in the
Hay
west.
mucha más gente en la
There's
costa
nobody
este,
in
en la
here.
costa oeste. Al medio no hay nadie.
I live up there.
Yo vivo por
I
aquí,
grew up right there.
por aquí me crié.
If you know the United States, if you visited some cities, you can probably say, oh yeah, I know that city. That's New York, I went there. That's Chicago, I went there. San Francisco, Los Angeles, right? It's pretty easy.
Típico. Muy fácil, ¿no?
But I don't really learn very much more from this much data. 300 million data points, there's not very much to learn in some ways.
300 millones de puntos de datos.
Let's focus.
Entonces, vamos a,
This is a piece of Brooklyn, New York.
aquí tenemos
This is maybe
el área de Brooklyn, en
maybe a million, maybe a few 100,000 people.
sí,
So less than 1%.
menos de un millón de personas.
Less than 1% of the whole data set.
Por ciento de todos
But
los
now,
datos que vemos.
this is really interesting.
Miren qué interesante es esto, fíjense.
How did these little neighborhoods get here, right? These are two different ethnicities
Estos
living within a much bigger neighborhood
son etnias de
of
tamaños
different people.
distintas.
How did that
Era
happen?
de otra raza.
Where are the subway stops? Who lives close to a subway and who doesn't?
Las paradas de
Where are the houses most expensive and where are they not?
casas más caras.
Right? Who's close to the industrial area? Who's close to the parks? We can ask really interesting questions now because we focused on 1% or less than 1% of the data. Now we can talk about really, really interesting questions because we're not overwhelmed. It's not too much to deal with. We can focus a little bit and it becomes much more interesting.
Y asertivas. Tener un foco.
The next slide is my favorite dashboard.
Esta es la que me gusta más de
1 bit.
solamente un bit.
1 bit of data. Now, many, many gigabytes of data goes into building that dashboard, but it's a 1-bit dashboard.
Panel de control.
The dashboard says, do I need an umbrella today?
Comparado.
Right? This is, I'm late to work, I have to run to catch the bus,
Tengo que correr para tomar la
I don't know what jacket I need to grab. If I'm already late and I'm in a hurry, I don't want the map with the low pressure zone coming in from the ocean combining, like, no, is it gonna rain? I just wanna know if it's gonna rain. This is a very valuable dashboard because it doesn't give me data, it gives me an answer.
de control.
And that's what I need in that moment. I need an answer, this tells me an answer. Makes it easier to learn.
Así es más fácil de entender.
All right. There's only a few really fundamental purposes. You combine them in all different ways, but there's only a few purposes.
Fundamentales, aun cuando nos podemos
I want to compare things. Which one's bigger, which one's smaller?
Por ejemplo, ¿cuál es el mayor? ¿Cuál es el?
I want to show how things
Quiero
change.
saber si hay cambios.
I want to show composition. This is like a pie graph. Where's my budget being spent? What are all the different categories my revenue is coming from?
Distintas categorías que me aportan ingresos.
I want to show correlation. How are these two numbers related? If I change one, does that change the other one?
Si cambio uno, cambiará el
And finally, geography.
finalmente la geografía.
Most of the time, most of your purposes are going to be one of these or a combination of these.
Aquí, en esta lista, uno de
I want to see the rank and I want to see how rank changes over time. That's a combination of two purposes, but it's all just these fundamental purposes.
pero siempre van a estar
Okay, so what?
unos de estos. ¿Y de qué me sirve esto?
The reason we have to think about
El motivo por el cual
which of these fundamental purposes we are using is
fundamentales, cuáles nos sirven,
different graph types
es porque hay distintos
support these different purposes. Not just because of convention, but because of how our brain interprets the different graph types. This goes back to the research I showed earlier on.
la información de los gráficos.
So we know the different basic graph types and some combinations. There's some more interesting examples here.
Típicos, básicos y algunas
But we use them in different situations because of how our brain interprets them, because of how our brain sees the data that's available and understands the connections or the relationships between the data based on the type of the graph.
los datos, ¿no? Entre los distintos datos de cada gráfico.
Bar graphs are pretty good.
Los gráficos de barra,
What's the shortest bar on the screen?
¿cuál es la barra más corta de la pantalla?
Anybody?
¿Alguien?
Yeah, blue. It's this little one here. How long did that take you to find?
¿Cuánto tiempo te demoraste en encontrarla?
Like 1 second, right? Like no time at all.
Cero.
Can you tell it's shorter than that green one?
Ahí
Yeah, it's shorter.
es más baja que la verde.
How about week 2? Can you see which one's taller here?
¿Cuál es la más alta de las barras en la segunda?
Yeah, right, the orange one. Everybody can see that.
Todos pueden ver.
How much taller is that?
¿Cuánto más
I
alta
mean,
es esa
the
barra?
scale here, we go up to 90%.
Es una escala con 90%.
That's like 1% difference, maybe 2% difference.
Quizás 2% más.
Now, if I take my glasses off, I can't see that.
Los lentes no ven
But
nada.
more or less, if you can see reasonably well, you can see this tiny difference, 1%, right?
Pequeñísimas
Bars are great for precision.
barras son muy buenas para precisión.
The bars are never going to be as precise as a table of data, as the digits printed out.
Tablas de datos con
But for looking at the trend, for saying, oh yeah, that one's a little bit bigger, bars are really precise. And the reason is our eye and our brain get the most precision
ojos y nuestro cerebro
out of position.
tienen
We can say that one's a little higher and that one's a little lower, and that tiny difference, I can see that tiny difference.
veo esta pequeñita diferencia.
So you can also use position in different ways.
Utilizar
This is the same thing. Now I use position horizontally.
mismo, pero estamos
I don't even need the bar.
ni siquiera necesitamos
I just need the position, and I can say, oh, in these dots, this one's a little bit further from that away than that one. These are almost the same.
estas están casi alineadas.
I can look, up and down and compare the position of these different ones. No bars necessary.
No se necesitan barras aquí, ¿no?
The other thing that's interesting about bars is how I group them makes a difference into how I interpret them.
Eso también hace
So
la diferencia.
right now, I can look at each week, week 1, week 2, and I can say, who performed best week 1, who performed best week 2. This is a pretty good way to look at that.
Muy fácil.
But it's harder to look at this and say, how does orange behave compared to how does green behave week over week?
¿Cómo se compara
This isn't so good for the trend over time. It's okay, but it's not the easiest.
complicado, ¿no es cierto?
Same data set.
Aquí tenemos el mismo
Now I
dato,
can
pero
say,
exactamente el mismo.
how did orange behave
Puedo ver la conducta
compared to how blue
verde
or green
con
behaves?
el naranja.
Lines show us continuity. They show us change over time. And our brain
Esto va a ser
sees the line and says, these are all connected.
va a ver las líneas.
I can still do the comparing who was best in week 2, who was best in week 1, but this helps me quite a lot understand how the change of a single line color was behaved differently than a different line color change.
En el mes, por ejemplo, o las 4 semanas de corrido. La diferencia
There's always a question for my line graph or any graph.
vamos a tener
Do I go all the way down to 0 or do I stop just where the data is up at the top?
iniciar los datos. ¿Dónde comienza?
The answer, which is always the answer for everything,
Siempre va a ser la respuesta para
it
ti.
depends on your purpose.
Depende del propósito.
If what I really care about is comparing the full value,
Es comparar.
you have to show the 0. The 0 is very important.
Ahí sí, sí.
Because if I have the full value, I can see
Tengo el valor
that these changes are pretty small.
total. Me voy a dar cuenta cuán pequeño es el
However, if I'm really interested in the small changes, if I'm looking at a stock price and it's
precio de la acción.
about $100, if it goes from $101 to $102,
101 a 102 dólares.
it's pretty small on a graph where you can see all 100%.
Alza de ese precio de la acción.
But if I want to magnify those small changes,
Esos pequeñitos
then I can get rid
puedo
of all the lower data points.
de todos
I can chop off the graph, compress the lower data points, and what I end up with is it magnifies the small changes. It makes those small changes easier to see.
estos pequeños.
So the answer, there's not an always answer of whether you go the graph all the way down to 0 or whether you just show. It depends. Do I need to show the total value or do I need to show the small changes?
Matices,
What do I need to magnify? That's the important question.
simplificar, bueno, va a depender de la necesidad, del propósito.
Pies,
Aquí tenemos
there's 3 important things about pie graphs.
de torta.
They have to go to 100%.
Deben llenar.
If they don't add up to 100%, something's broken.
Algo está mal, algo no funciona.
You don't get very much precision with the pie graph.
Precisión aquí, eso sí, en este tipo.
Our brain is not very good at comparing these angles,
Vamos a comparar, por ejemplo, estos ángulos.
so we put the labels on the pies usually.
Definitivamente, porcentaje
And like I said, you always get the most precision out of the digits printed out. It's always going to be more precise than just looking at the graph. And if your graph is very
barras de colores.
imprecise,
Solo estas tajadas.
you'll never get the real detail looking at the shape of these on a pie.
Van a tener claridad
It's
real.
best to show the digits with them. So number 1 with pies, 100%.
Poner los números.
Number 2 with pies, not very precise. You're not going to ever convey exact information with the pie very usefully.
Dar una información muy precisa para usted que
And then one thing that's useful with the pie is, I forgot one. Number 3,
tercer elemento para este tipo de gráfico.
You'll get a few slices. You'll be able to see the biggest slices and the differences in the biggest slices. But after the top,
fácilmente las
3, 4, 5, 8 slices, depends on how big they are.
5, 8 quizás.
If I had a bunch of small slices, you can't really see them. You can't really see the difference. If I had a whole bunch of little tiny slices here that were all less than 10%,
17%
those are going to be much harder to compare because the changes between them are going to be so small. So with the pie, you're really best going to be able to represent only the biggest slices, maybe 6. It depends on how big they are. There's not an exact number.
normalmente se usan los gráficos cuando son
And it's useful for a pie if you sort them from biggest to smallest. That makes it easier to compare the largest ones first.
de compararlos de mayor
So,
tamaño en primer lugar.
Here's an example. If I asked you which pie slice is biggest in each pie,
Es la tajada más grande
it's very hard to
de
tell.
cada gráfico. Bien difícil de
But if we look at the bars and we say which slice is biggest, which slice is smallest,
cuál es la tajada
it's much,
o
much
el
easier.
pedazo más grande.
This is from Wikipedia, by the way. I was really excited when I saw this graphic because it's such a wonderful example.
Pareció excelente el ejemplo.
They say, here's how you tell which slice is the biggest in a pie. You slice the pie, you put the pie in front of a table of 12-year-olds, and they will tell you exactly which one's the biggest very, very quickly.
Niños de 12 años inmediatamente van a saber
That may
cuál
be
es el
true,
pedazo más grande.
but they won't be able to tell you how many % bigger it is. They just say, I want the big one.
Eso que les tocó, van a decir, "Quiero el más grande".
Great example, and here you can see
Es un buen ejemplo.
the very small changes are very evident in the bar graph, and they're very hard to see in the pie.
Evidentes en las barras, pero no tan evidentes en el gráfico de carta.
Okay, scatter plots.
Estos gráficos,
Any two metrics, any two numbers that relate to the same thing,
hay dos números
you
que
can use in a scatter plot. This is one
con
of movies. Was the original movie or the sequel better? So we have how good was the original movie on this
Vamos
axis?
a ver, por ejemplo, lo bueno
How
o
good
malo
was the
fue
sequel on this
una,
axis?
película.
If they were both rated exactly the same, they would fall on the diagonal here. And there's some really good ones up there. If the first one was okay and the second one was better, the sequel is better up here. If the first movie was really good and the sequel doesn't cross the line, all of these movies, the first one was better than the sequel. And so there's some Star Wars movies up here. I think the Terminator movies are up here. There's some pretty good movies. The Godfather movies are up here. And then there's a lot of terrible movies down there where the first movie was really good and somebody said, let's make that money again. Let's make another movie. And it was not so good. By the way, one more data point on these. The size of the bubble is how much money the sequel made. So already we have 3 different data points that we're showing very easily here in the scatter plot. We'll talk more about fancy scatter plots in a minute. This is a combined line graph and bar graph. This is for the US military. Number of soldiers, and then the budget. It's a stupid amount of money. And this is 30 years worth of data. You can sort of see how these change at different times, but it's a little bit difficult to tell what the relationship is. But if we have 2 values that are changing over the same time period, we can plot them on a scatter plot. Same 2 data points. This is number of soldiers, amount of money being spent. But now time, instead of time being the major axis here, time is these little bubbles, these little dots. A new one for every year. And this is really interesting because we can say, oh, here's some years. Things didn't change very much at all. And some years where there was a little pause, but huge change every year. Huge change in the budget, right? 75 billion to almost 250 billion. Like a tripling of the budget in just a few years. This author has also done really interesting work where he started labeling things. Here's the color by who was president, label the name of the president, and then there's interesting events that happen. Financial crisis, oh, let's spend less money. Afghanistan war, let's spend more money. September 11th, all the Gulf War, all the different things that happen. This is an advanced technique for a scatter plot, but if you're analyzing behaviors over time, this is a super powerful way of doing it. I find these really interesting, really compelling. But you have to have good data, and it's a good practice. Okay, so we've been talking about structure. We've talked about some of the most basic bar graph, line graph, pie, scatter plot. These are sort of the usual structures that we're used to. But there's a lot of different ways you can put the pixels on the page, or you can put the ink on the page. There's many, many ways that you can structure your data to communicate effectively. In some situations, you can borrow from the reality that people know. If you use something that people are already familiar with, it helps them learn and understand what the data is good at. What the data is used for, what the data is useful for. So borrow your structure from the reality that people know. This was a study. They got the same dress size for many different manufacturers, and they measured to see how all the different manufacturers, even at the same size that they were selling, they all fit very differently. This is just a line graph, right? It's just a line graph turned on its side. But you can see, here's what they were measuring: the bust, the waist, the hip. If you're someone who buys clothing shaped like this, you know exactly what this is right away. It's probably more useful like this, vertically oriented, just like a dress would be, than it would be if we had a regular line graph horizontally. So this is a nice way to borrow from the reality that people already know, something that people already know. They don't need to learn a second time when you graph the data against it. Here's another example. Baseball. These are the angles that the ball was hit. Number of times the hit was at that angle, and then which hits were successful and which ones were not. And this is great because we can say, oh, looks like when he hits down here, not much luck. When he hits up there, not much luck. But right through the middle, that's pretty good. So you could graph this with a scatter plot. You could uncurve this and just do a bar graph. That would be fine. But the reality that people are familiar with of how the balls fly up in the air, go on the ground, makes it easier to understand the data very clearly in this situation. All right. Next slide, we're only going to show for just a little while because it's bad examples. There's only one slide with bad examples. I don't want you to remember them. Just know to not do them. I'll go a little bit quick for this. 3D, don't do it. If somebody really wants 3D, you say, no, no, no. These days, everything's very flat, very modern. The problem with 3D is it distorts your data. You cannot look at one of these little sections and read it against the scale. There's no way. There's no precision. You just can't understand what the data actually is. Anytime you have three-dimensional data and you flatten it to 2 dimensions like this, there's going to be problems. There's going to be distortions. Just say no to 3D. All right. People like taking bars and bending them around in a circle. There's 2 ways to interpret that. One way is the length of the bar, this really long red bar, this shorter green bar. Which one's longer? Well, this one says 60 and that one says 50. No, it's not the length of the bar. We're going how far around the circle of the clock. Which one? Whichever one you choose as the designer, half of your audience will get it wrong. There's no way to be right. Don't do that. Here's a very large pie. It's 193% pie. This pie is 93% larger than any pie in reality. Don't do that. This is called a radar graph or a spiderweb graph. It's okay sometimes. The problem with this one is these axes, marketing, development, customer support, I could arrange them in any order. And if I change how I arrange these axes, it's going to change the shape that the data draws. And that means the shape is not really completely about the data. It's as much about how did I choose my axes. And if I move my axes, the shape changes. That can be very misleading. What we want is to have the data really show the shape and have nothing else really affect the shape very much. Don't do these. These will all distort your data and make it hard to understand. Here's two examples of using a radar plot or a spiderweb plot where my data goes around in a circle. So just like on the baseball graphic, we were using those angles to show the reality of where the ball was being hit. Here, this is activity over 12 hours during the daytime and then 12 hours at night. This could be traffic. It could be numbers of calls to the call center. It could be number of posts on Twitter or Facebook, something like that. And because time goes around in a circle, cyclically, it's okay to show my data going around the same way, going around in a circle. This can be very useful to say, oh, the first part of the morning, there was a lot of traffic, and then around 8 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, not so much. Pretty useful. Also, lots more in the day, not so much at night. Pretty good way to represent that data. That's a good structure. It matches the data, and it matches how people understand that things go around in a cycle. I could also unfold that, right? That could just be a line graph for 12 hours or for 24 hours. That'd be fine too. But this is a nice use of the circle that we already know on a clock to show the data moves around in the same way. Same thing on this one, except now we're looking at months of the year. This is an animated GIF, the original format. I should have played it live, but I apologize I didn't. This is showing monthly temperatures. Starts around 1850. And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until here we are. The planet is getting warmer. And we can see how the temperatures change over the course of the year. Because again, time goes in a circle, the months repeat, and so we can show many, many years worth of data all using the same 12 months, using that round format. These are pretty good structures if your data is cyclical like this. Okay. We talked about purpose. We talked about structure, content. We talked about picking a structure. Formatting. Formatting is your coloring, your labels, typography, interaction, grid lines, axes, all these little details. We're not going to talk a huge amount about this because this is like a year of graduate school that I'm going to compress in the next 10 minutes. But here's the answer. Beautiful frosting will not save a bad cake. It doesn't matter how beautiful the cake is. If it's bad cake, the frosting won't save it. Beautiful formatting will not save you from having the wrong data, from having something designed for the wrong customer, for picking the wrong graph type. It doesn't matter how pretty the font is, how beautiful the colors are. You have to get your purpose, your content, and your structure solid before the frosting becomes useful. Now the frosting adds appeal, it adds focus, and we'll talk about that, but it comes last. Is anybody else in college when I'd be like writing a paper and like one page, spell check, change the font. It doesn't matter, finish writing the paper, 2 pages, spell check, change the font. No, write the paper. You can do all that last. Same thing here. Okay. This table, before you all take pictures, although you're welcome to, can you see the URL at the bottom here? So this is complexdiagrams.com/properties. You can download this. Everything I'm about to say for the next 5 minutes you can download. You can download a PDF of this. It's all there for free. I'm not the first person to draw this table, but this is my version. Based on all the research of what we know of how the eye and the brain see and interpret these different visual properties, this is the cheat sheet. This tells you how to say, I have some data, how do I encode it properly? The way it works is you pick your data type up here and you read down and you find the word good, and then you read across and it shows you what a useful visual encoding is. There's 4 data types I talk about here. Quantitative, this is any kind of numeric data. We know what that looks like. Ordinal data, this is ranked. First, second, third. this happened, then that happened, then the other one happened. People like this one best, that one second best, nobody liked the other one. Categorical data. This is data that has no rank, has no number, could be different sports teams, could be different cities, could be different shoe styles, could be different brands of car, could be anything, different categories. Finally, there's a category here for relational data. This is like these are connected to, these belong to a group together, this influences that sort of thing. I want to point out a few more things. The top row for position and placement, you'll notice it says good for all categories. We can use position for any type of data. That's why we talk about structure first. We pick the placement on the page before we talk about color, before we talk about icons, before we talk about whether the line is solid or dotted. Position is the most powerful. It's usually the easiest to see. And because it's the most powerful and the easiest and the most precise, we want to use it for our most important data and our most important relationships. That's why we talk about structure first. Pick the graph first, pick the axes first, then we can talk about color, we can talk about size, we can talk about those afterwards. Text is up here. Text also says good for all these, but that's language, it's not really visual. I had to include it in the chart, but remember, position, that's the most important one. Okay. The mapping from here over to there, it depends on these two columns in the middle. The two columns in the middle are how our brain and our eye perceive all these different ways of drawing anything. The first one here is whether your brain believes that that kind of data is ordered. So if I say, which of these is left and which of these is right, we can all agree which one's left and which one's right. If I say which of these is bigger and which of these is smaller, we all agree which is bigger and which is smaller. If I say what comes first, orange or purple, it's not a thing. If I say is blue more or less important than pink, it's not a thing. If I say is stripes better than plaid or polka dot, it's not a thing. There are some things our brain does not think is ordered. Some things definitely there's an order, some things our brain does not believe is ordered. So you notice right here, color, people hate this. Your brain does not think color is ordered. We all know what the rainbow is, fine. We can go measure that. If you want to measure wavelength, that's fine. But my brain doesn't know that the colors are ordered in the same way that my brain knows which one's on the left and which one's on the right, which one's higher, which one's lower, bigger, smaller. We all agree on those, but color doesn't work that way. What that means is you should not use different colors to represent numbers. You can use brightness, very light color to very dark color, to show how numbers change, but probably changing colors of the rainbow, not the best way to show numbers. Okay. This column here, how many useful values are there? What does useful mean here? Useful means I can see the differences and I can talk about the differences. If I have a huge display, I have an almost infinite number of different positions that I can perceive the differences in, right? 1 or 2 pixels difference, most of us can see that, even from the back of the room. So that's almost infinite. It just depends on how big your display is. If we come down here and look at something like angle, we can all tell time on the clock, so we know we get at least 12 different angles that we can compare, right? We can probably do 24, but I don't think if I have one angle over here and one angle over there, can I tell a 1 minute difference? Probably not. If I hand you 2 unlabeled clocks and one of them is 17 minutes after the hour and one of them is 18 minutes after the hour, and I rotate the clock in weird ways. Can you tell which one's bigger? Maybe not. We're not as good at angle. The eye and the brain just don't see that same level of precision with angle. So even though my computer can draw any angle, any infinite number of angles, there's not as many that we call useful because I can't usefully differentiate them. I can't usefully talk about them. Same thing with color. We run out of colors that we have good words for, interestingly enough. And then you get the problem where someone says, that one there, is that light blue or is that sky blue? Is that rose or is that salmon? We run out, literally, we run out of words for the colors when we have to talk about them. So there's a really good list of 20 colors that are far apart in color space so we can all see the differences, hopefully even if you're colorblind, and we can talk about the differences. But you start to add more colors than that, it becomes harder and harder to talk about them. All right. So that's why we use the word useful here in this column. And this is the result that this gives us. Let's look at some examples of what we can do applying this formatting to data. Heat maps. Heat maps are great. Why? They tell us what's important. They tell us what to look at. With no color, this would just be a lot of digits. Much like the very first example I showed, it'd be very hard to see what was important. It'd be very hard to see what was useful. In this case, we can see the darkest green here. These are probably important and good. We can see the darkest red. These are probably important in some other way. Honestly, all these middle yellow kind of in-between values, we could just leave those blank. Like put the digits, but we maybe don't even have to color those. If it's only a little bit different, that's fine. I don't care. Which ones do I care about? I care about the largest differences. So we color maybe just the very largest ones. This is a great use of formatting exactly to call attention. Show me what's important. Show me where the answer is. Don't make me look at every digit on the page. Show me the ones that I care about the most. If we do that effectively, we provide a lot of value. We can also encode a lot of data using that formatting, using that table to pick visual properties that map very well to the different data types that we're looking at. So how much data is on this graphic? This is from a website called Gapminder. It's a free-to-use website that has a ton of data about global health. There's a wonderful, wonderful TED Talk by a guy named Hans Rosling who died in this last year. He was a public health researcher, statistician, and his TED Talk is fantastic. He tells the story of how the world is changing using graphs like this. So how much data do we have here? There's one bubble for every country in the world. The bubbles have a color depending on what region of the world they're in. The bubbles have a size, that's China. Bubbles have a size depending on the population. We have one scale here for income and one scale here for life expectancy, right? So we already have 200 countries, more or less, times population, times region, times life expectancy, times income. So we're already dealing with 5 different axes of data, just to begin. This interactive has a play button, so you can rewind history to a certain point in time and push play and see what happened. If you highlight a country, it'll show you, when you push play, it'll draw the history of the country. It'll leave that trail that shows you what happened with that country over the years that you're watching that play. So you can see, for example, Vietnam. When the Vietnam War ended, life expectancy got better. No surprise. And after that, they started to earn more money. Romania made a little bit more money, but the life expectancy didn't really improve over that same period of time. That's not so hard to understand, and that's kind of amazing, right? We're dealing with thousands and thousands and thousands of data points, and we've just told this very interesting story of two countries and how they changed over a few decades of history. There's really good use of encoding here. We have position, we have size, we have color. We can do this time trail and a little bit of a label that shows us. So this is giving us access to thousands of data points in a way that we can understand pretty easily. This is made possible by having a really good purpose. We know what the purpose was, to show the comparison of these countries. We've picked the data that supports the purpose we need: population size, income, health, etc., what region of the world. A scatter plot like this is a really good structure to show a lot of related data. Now it gets complicated. This is an advanced visualization. If you show this to somebody who doesn't know very much about the data or doesn't know very much about the scatter plots and how scatter plots work, this could get confusing. But if you have a more sophisticated consumer who knows how scatter plots work or who's familiar with the data, this can be a very, very powerful way of communicating a lot of information to them. And this is built as an interactive, so you show them one version, and then they can go in and make changes. They can pick the countries that they want to look at. They can look at the time period that they want to look at. So we're not giving them one answer, we're giving them the tools to find whatever answer they want within this sort of well-defined set of data and information that they can interact with and explore. Don't get too crazy. We still haven't used icons here. We haven't really, we've a little bit, but not really. We could do all different levels of transparency. We could change the lines around each country to be solid lines and dotted lines. It's easy to get too confusing if you try to use too much data, so just be careful with that. Okay, here's the summary of everything we just talked about. You have to have a purpose that talks about who your customer is and why you're designing the visualization for them. That's the most important thing. That's important, by the way, when you're designing anything for anybody to use. When you're making dinner, that's important to think about. When you're talking to your mother, that's important to think about. Definitely your boss, your investors, your customers. Edit your content to only what's necessary. Show the people the answers that they need. Don't show them necessarily all the data that's possible. It's very tempting. Don't do it. Select the right structure for your purpose and your content. There's a lot of ways, a lot of different graphs that'll work for the same data. Your purpose will tell you what's the right one. Use formatting to focus people's attention, to allow them to interact. Formatting should highlight what's important. It's very easy to make it distracting. Better when it's used intentionally to make sure that people are seeing the right data, seeing the right answers that they need. Everybody got the pictures? You can download all this. This is all on my blog. And take pictures. Thank you so much. So here's a few more links. Please talk to me on Twitter. It's way better than an email. My email inbox is where conversations go to die, but I answer questions on Twitter. These links, this is the talk we just saw, 4 Pillars, complexdiagrams.com. There's blog posts about this, there's downloads, there's earlier recordings of the talk, there's slide decks, there's like 5 hours of information that's all related to what we just looked at. The properties table, there's a page to download the properties table, download the PDF and a paper I wrote. It's like 10 pages, it's mostly pictures that talks about what we just talked about, how to use the table, how we got there, how to pick the right property. There's a link here, which I know you can't click because it's on the screen. There's a link to a video that I gave at LinkedIn a couple of years ago. It's almost 2 hours. That talk was before I designed this talk. So it's, all the information is compatible, but it's a lot more different information as well. If you want to learn more, there's a ton there in that talk. My favorite talk that I ever gave About 10 minutes, 11 minutes. It's called When Not to Use Maps. It's very accessible. I think it's funny. You might not think it's funny, but I think it's funny. My friend Cole Nussbaumer, she's also a visualization expert. She said, every time I sit down to use Excel, I think all of the defaults are wrong. The colors are wrong. The fonts are wrong. The grid lines are wrong. Everything's wrong. So she said, I sat down to use Excel and I would change all these defaults. And I realized I changed all the same defaults every time I use Excel. So she saved a template. I call it Unbroken Excel. There's a link to this on my blog. If you scroll down a couple entries, there's a link and she has this Excel template where she's fixed everything. Finally, I work for Amazon Web Services. I was hired at Amazon to work on a tool called QuickSight, which is our data visualization, business intelligence tool for big data. And I worked on that team for about a year and a half. Some of what we just saw in this talk, I was able to bake into the product. I think the product should not just let you draw any graph in the world, although that's a nice feature, but the product should help you draw the right graph. Not any random graph you can think of, but the right graph for the data that you're working with. And I tried to bake some of that into the product. So QuickSight's pretty cheap to use. I think it's kind of easy, almost easy enough. And if you have really big data, if you have a 200 gigabyte data set, it's hard to do that on your laptop. But we can give you, we're Amazon, we can give you a machine with 200 gigabytes of RAM, no problem, if you want to process that in real time on that. So if you want to check out QuickSight, that would be wonderful. I don't have time to do questions from the stage, but if you want to ask questions afterwards, come find me one-on-one. I'll be around the conference today. Thank you so very much for having me here. I've had a wonderful time in Santiago.